All right, today we're jumping into a topic that's right at the intersection of family, money, and the law. It's financial support, or fuyang, in Taiwan. Now, I know it can sound complex, maybe even a little intimidating, but we're going to break it all down plain and simple. Look, it's a situation so many of us have either been through or, worried about. A relationship ends, maybe a marriage. And suddenly, there are all these really practical, really urgent questions, especially if there are kids. Who's responsible for the bills? Who pays for what? Well, thankfully, the law gives us a roadmap for these incredibly tough conversations.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we have to start at square one. What are we even talking about when we say financial support in a legal sense?
The absolute key word here is duty. You really gotta get this. This isn't just a friendly suggestion or a nice thing to do for family. In Taiwan, fuyang is a legal requirement. It's this core idea that family members have a binding responsibility to step up when someone in the family just can't make ends meet on their own. And this duty, it isn't random. It applies to a very specific web of family relationships. You see it most often between parents and their kids, and of course between spouses. But the law also stretches that obligation up to grandparents and down to grandchildren, and sometimes it even goes sideways to include siblings. The rule of thumb? The closer the family connection, the stronger that legal duty is.
And that leads us to the big one, doesn't it? The question on everyone's mind. If you've got this duty to pay, how much are we talking about? And it's definitely not a simple one-size-fits-all answer.
What the court does is this really careful balancing act. On one side of the scale, they look at the person who needs the support. What do they actually need? What are their basic living costs, their education expenses, any special medical bills? Then, on the other side, they weigh the pair's ability to help out. What's their income? What assets do they have? What's their total financial picture look like? Now, to get a starting point for that needs side of the scale, courts will often look at official government data. So, for example, back in 2023, the average monthly spend for a person in Taipei was just over 34,000 NT dollars. This number is often brought up as a benchmark, but, and this is a huge but, it is not the final word.
And this is just a brilliant example of how the system tries to be fair. The courts themselves get it. They know that in what's called an M-shaped society, where you have a big gap between high and low incomes, just using a simple average is not going to work for everybody. A judge actually wrote that in a ruling, saying that forcing that number on someone with a lower income would be an unbearable burden.
So the bottom line is this. The system is built to be fair, not just to follow a formula. That average spending number, it's a reference point, a guide. But the final decision always comes down to the real-life situation of the actual people standing in that courtroom.
Okay, but what if someone was supposed to be paying this whole time and they just haven't? This is such a common and incredibly frustrating problem for so many people.
I mean, just imagine it. You've been the one covering every single cost for your child for years. Groceries, rent, school supplies, everything. Meanwhile, the other parent hasn't chipped in a dime. Does the law just shrug and say, oh, well, too bad? No way. You might just be able to get that money back.
The legal tool you use for this is called unjust enrichment, or budangdeli. And the logic behind it is actually really simple. The other person had a legal duty to pay. They didn't, so they unfairly benefited, right? They got to keep all that money, and you carried their share of the burden. The law says you have a right to claim that benefit back.
Now, I know what you're probably thinking, but how could I possibly prove what I spent? I don't have receipts for every carton of milk and every electricity bill from the last 5 years. Well, here is some seriously good news. The Taiwan High Court has gone on record saying they get it. They know it's completely unrealistic to expect someone to have a perfect file of receipts for daily life. And this is what makes it so empowering. Because the court understands that, it means they can estimate what you're owed. As long as you can show you were the one providing all the care, the court can look at the evidence you do have, consider those standard living costs we talked about, and figure out a fair amount. You do not need a flawless paper trail to get justice. All right, we have got to talk about one of the biggest, most emotional points of confusion
in all of family law. And that's the mix-up between who gets custody of the kids and who has to pay. Let's pull these two things apart. They are two completely separate issues in the eyes of the law. Custody, 亲权, is all about the child's well-being. Who is the best person to take care of them day to day? But financial support, 抚养费, that's purely about the economics. It's about who has the money to meet the child's financial needs. Two different questions, two different answers. And this is probably the most important thing to understand about that separation. It means the parent with less money can absolutely get custody. A person's income is just one small factor the court looks at. It's totally possible. In fact, it's common for the court to decide the lower income parent is the better caregiver. And the other parent, their legal duty to pay support doesn't vanish. If anything, it becomes even more important. So, we've talked a lot about parents supporting children. But what happens when the tables are turned? What happens when a parent who was never there for you suddenly shows up needing your financial help?
This is just a gut-wrenching question, isn't it? The law says children have a duty to support their parents in need. But what if that parent walked out on you? What if they were abusive or just never fulfilled their own duty when you were a child? Are you still on the hook financially?
Okay, the legal process here is very, very specific, and it's often a shock to people. First, you can't just decide on your own to stop paying. That duty is legally in place until you go to court and ask a judge to change it. Second, the court will then investigate. They'll look at the history and decide if the parent's failure to support you was serious and without a good reason. But here's the third step, and this one is the real kicker. The ruling doesn't go back in time. I'm going to say that again because it's so vital to understand. Your legal duty to support that parent exists right up until the second a judge makes an official order saying it doesn't. Any support that was due before that final decision, technically, you're still responsible for it. It can feel harsh, but that is how the law is written. So let's just pull it all together. What should you take away from all this? First, financial support is a legal duty, a constant balancing act between someone's need and someone's ability to pay. Second, the law gives you a real path to claim back past unpaid support, even if your bookkeeping isn't perfect. Third, remember, custody and cash are two totally separate things. And finally, and maybe most critically, escaping a support obligation, even to an absent parent, isn't automatic. It takes a formal court order. You know, the law gives us all these rules, these structures for our financial duties to one another. But it leaves us with a much bigger, much more human question. The law can define our obligations, but it can never define the love, the connection, the forgiveness that really holds a family together. What that part means? Well, that's up to us. Thanks for joining The Explainer.